Welcome to the Cultivate Church Planting podcast. We believe that the gospel is the hope of the world and that the world needs more gospel-centered churches. Okay, welcome to the Cultivate Church Planting podcast. I'm here, your host, Brian Kelly, and I'm here with my very good friends, partners in crime, Mike Vincent,
yes,
Bruce Zachary, and Bruce and I are on the Cultivate Church Planting core team. There's 4 of us. And Bruce is the mastermind of the Calvary Chapel Church Planting Manual, which he wrote and which billions of church plants are using to this day. How many people have downloaded that book, Bruce? Do you have the numbers for that?
Oh, gosh, the last I heard it was over 30,000. So,
Yeah.
Wow.
But I am just so honored to be here with my dear friends, Mike from Calvary Rosarito, and Brian. I so appreciate who you are and the privilege of serving with you, but doing the podcast with you.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Blessed to be up here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So Mike is a church planter, and interesting fact, so we planted a church in Kampala, Uganda. We were part of a church planting team, and that was in 2000, I can't even remember, 2002, Mike?
Yes,
Mike
exactly the same year.
They planted exactly the same year in Rosarito, Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So cross-cultural church planting is the kind of the topic of the day, and specifically as it relates to Mexico. Something else that's really cool about Mike that we'll get into here on the show is he's got a church planting school in his church and has sent out and planted nearly 40.
Yeah, 35 first-generation church plants.
Nice. So we want to know how to do that.
Yes, yes.
We want to hear about it. We want to know how to do it, how to replicate that, and also I think it'd be good for our listeners to be able to get insight into how to go cross-culturally.
Yes.
You know, there's a guy out there who thinks, I want to plant a church, but I don't want to do it in my neighborhood or my town or whatever. I want to go to Iceland or, you know, or somewhere else, Russia or China. Where do you?
You're on a roll.
I'm on a roll. Where else can we plant a church? Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
That looks like a field that's mighty open.
But Mike, why don't you tell us about that first church plant back in Rosarito? Your thoughts, like what happened there?
Yes. So when I got married, my wife felt called to go to Mexico. She'd grown up in Santa Ana. She was the only white girl in her class and not a Christian. When she got born again, she really thought that she was going to find a guy that was called to move to Mexico, some little village in Mexico, and, you know, farm in something, or I don't know what her thoughts were, but they weren't my thoughts. But she married me by faith, and about 5 years after we got married, we both felt the call to move to church plant in Mexico. We had that feeling. It was absolutely from the Lord. We didn't know where, we didn't know when. So we talked to our pastor, Pastor Trent Douglas of Calvary Chapel Saving Grace, a good friend of yours as well. Mm-hmm. And we asked him, hey, what do we need to do to prepare to move to Mexico to church plant? And he told me a bunch of things that I didn't do, including going to language school. That's why I only knew 3 words of Spanish when I went down, burrito, baño, and taco. But he did give us...
Translate for Bruce. What's the translation here?
I know sin chile, without chile, without the salsa. Yeah. That much I've learned from my friend.
And so thankfully we were part of a church that had the willingness to not only train us up, but take a step of faith and send us out to do cross-cultural missions. And the way we really got that vision was, studying through the book of Acts. As we studied through the book of Acts, our pastor talked about God's heart to send out and that we want to be a sending hub. And then when God raised up some people that were ready to go, they were ready to put their money where their mouth is and send us out to do cross-cultural missions. Of course, Montana, and then England, and then you guys and some others in Uganda, and then us in Rosarito, Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah, Mike, I think as you're just a wonderful example of someone who's done this internationally, but also I think that cross-cultural has a much broader sense that for you guys, going from Orange County to Rosarito is probably a distance of about 100 miles, literally. Yeah. And so that seems fairly close in a certain sense, but in another sense, it's worlds removed. And similarly, I imagine for somebody who is living in suburban Orange County to plant a church in, let's say, metropolitan Los Angeles, let's say the Arts District of Los Angeles or downtown LA or any of the neighborhoods, large neighborhoods around downtown, that also is cross-cultural. And I think many of us might not be sensitive to the idea that we're coming into another culture. We planted in Camarillo, that's only about 90 to 100 miles from Orange County, and is a suburban community, but again is very different than Orange County, where we are in the central coast of California. So what advice would you give to people in terms of understanding culture, expectations, how to understand a culture, how long it might take to understand a culture? What advice would you give?
The advice I'd give now are things that I didn't do then, unfortunately. But one is talk to some cross-cultural missionaries that have gone before, if possible. You know, in most countries, there's some Americans that have already been doing work there. And so talk to them and get their advice. Study the culture, and then go in and I would say just live there for a little bit before you start the work. You know, get used to, you know, I would say you live in a place with around the locals as opposed to behind a, guarded big gate or something like that. Live with the people, see where the people go, what the people do, and then just, love. Love covers a multitude of sins. Yeah. So ultimately, I'd say no matter what, that love is most important.
How did people receive you when you went over there? Because you're not. We've got an audio podcast here, and I'm gonna do my best. Can we describe Mike here? Does he look Hispanic to you, Bruce?
No, he's blue-eyed and he's tall and Caucasian,
handsome and everything.
Big tall white guy. Yeah.
Big tall white guy. So that's what I was trying to say in a nice way. How did they receive a big, tall, white guy down in Mexico?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm here to plant a church.
Yeah, shockingly well. I was really surprised because I literally did not speak any Spanish when I moved down. And so, I could say hi and goodbye and taco and all that stuff. But, we started a bilingual church. We still have a bilingual church to this day.
You preach in English.
Yes, and it's translated into Spanish. Although now, when we go to our Spanish church plants, I do preach in Spanish.
Okay.
But our church is a bilingual church.
How do you feel when you're preaching? Do you feel confident preaching in Spanish, or is it still you've been there for a long time, you know the language obviously, but how is that?
It's nerve-wracking because of one, a strong accent, and two, I make some grammatical mistakes. Yeah. But I'm always telling everybody else they got to step out in faith, so that's my time. So about 5 years ago, I decided when I go to our Spanish-only church plants, I'm going to preach in Spanish.
Yeah, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, because they're Spanish-only churches. And so it's difficult, but I'm getting better at it.
He's humble, but he's really good.
Yeah.
I've heard him.
No, I know he's good. I've been to Mike's church several times. We did mission trips there.
Yes.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your church, because it's a pretty awesome place. It's kind of like a hybrid, and I don't know if I'm right in saying this. Maybe you can clarify. In Mexico, with the younger generation especially, there's a real move toward some of the more modern worship and kind of that sort of thing. What's it like in your church? We're newcomers to your congregation on a Sunday morning. What's it like?
Yeah, so we've got a wonderful church. God has blessed us so much. So we're a border city, just 15 miles south of the border, right on the beach. So the city of Rosarito, 150,000, 10,000 expats that have their houses on the beach, and probably about 20,000 Mexican Americans and deported guys covered in tats, just like you, by the way, Brian. And so
thank you for clarifying.
You haven't been deported yet, but the tats are very similar. And so when you come into our church, we're blessed to have 3 weekend services. You're going to have a really very modern worship, but it's going to be bilingual.
Okay.
And so, yeah, our worship's bilingual. We actually put up both sets of worship lyrics on the screens.
Do you sing one verse in English, one verse in Spanish, that sort of thing?
Yes, the worship team does, but we actually have both sets of lyrics up on the screens.
Oh, wow.
So if people want to sing the entire thing in Spanish or English, or if they want to follow with the worship team.
Yeah.
And just a really nice facility, and we've got a little studio and the lights and all of that stuff, and we have a really good mix of elderly, middle class, families, young adults, and youngsters as well.
Well, I haven't been there in, it must be, how many years? 4
years.
4 years?
4 or 5
last
years,
time?
yeah.
But when I was there, I was really impressed with
Thank you.
with what you guys are doing down there. And even more impressive, I think, is the church planting that you guys are doing, because you're not just focused on one congregation, you're multiplying and planting churches, and you've got that heart, you have that vision since day one pretty much. And how difficult is it to plant from that kind of a hub because you're planting in Mexico for the most part, right?
Yeah, primarily, yeah.
Yeah, and then a few in the United States even, which is awesome. It's like, where's the mission field now? It's like Mexico sending churches to be planted in the United States. Yeah. But successful, not all of them, but talk about that church planting school and what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so for a long time we had the typical Calvary Chapel Bible College campus with classes throughout the week, and I'm not against it, but there wasn't a lot of fruit. A lot of people would just take class after class after class, and it didn't seem like their lives changed. They weren't serving, they weren't really involved. So about 8 years ago, I canceled that completely. And we said, all we're doing is church planting. We got a bunch of other studies, go to whatever you want. But our only deeper program is our church planting program. And then the requirements were a little higher. You got to be serving weekly and things like that. And so we open that to anybody, and the requirements to be in that are you're faithful to the church, and we have a definition of that. You're serving weekly at the church, and then you're open to being part of a church planting team or a lead church planter. And because we have that, we have some single ladies in there, we have a bunch of marrieds, we have some guys as well, and we have an afternoon class and an evening class, and they take a 3-hour class every week. And
these are people who work in full-time jobs.
Yeah,
or
most
their
of
lives.
them.
Okay.
A lot of our staffers and our interns, but yeah, most of them are people that have normal jobs. But the way we turn this thing on its head is, instead of them just sit down and take notes and learn more of Leviticus, and then you'll figure out church planting. We've kind of turned it around where the teaching practicum is the main part, where they're going to do a verse-by-verse teaching, and they're going to get critiqued by a pastor and 2 or 3 of their peers. And we've seen how quickly they improve when they get face-to-face critiques. And then we're going to end with
face-to-face critiques.
I know, but
I get them every week from my wife. She's like,
ouch, no comment.
No, she says I do pretty good most of the time.
Yeah,
she liked my teaching.
Yeah, so
I think she said that Brian was her 3rd favorite teacher.
But the critiques are so important. We require a positive and a constructive criticism.
Okay.
You have to give them both.
That's good.
So you start with the positive, and then everybody wants to be nice. I like it. No, they need some constructive criticism. Yeah. And then the final hour, we'll have a guest speaker like Pastor Bruce or you come, or me or one of our pastors, where we'll either teach doctrine or a leadership principle.
Yeah, so in the teaching critique, it's something like, what did Mike do well? And everyone will give some affirmation about the things you did well, and then maybe something that would gently tee up some areas for growth. So what are some things that Mike could do differently, that we could all learn from, that we could all grow? And so that also not only helps the person teaching, but the other students now become more sensitive, more aware of some of the elements of teaching by bringing it from below the radar, above the radar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bruce, they're using your church planting manual.
Yes.
At the school. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's one of the resources we have at Cultivate. You can actually go to cultivatechurchplanting.com, not only to get more interest or connect with Cultivate, but also to download that manual, which is amazing, by the way, and robust, and it's pretty comprehensive, I would say.
Covers everything.
Why don't you talk about that for a second, Bruce, because I love that resource.
So we had planted churches from Calvary Nexus or Calvary Chapel Camarillo, where I'm the founding pastor. I've been serving for 27 years. And one of the churches we planted in East Bay, San Francisco, that church still exists, but the pastor's marriage doesn't. And I just had an incredible sense of conviction that perhaps if I had done a better job of training or post-launch support, it could have been different. I didn't feel responsible for his marriage failing, but I thought I could have done a better job. And so I purposed to find a resource to train church planters, because we're now preparing to send a couple to Portland, Oregon.
Ooh, that's a mission field.
Yeah.
What language do they speak there?
Well, it's a developing country. And, so in that process, all of the resources that I was coming across had a lot of marketplace ideas. So it was really business practices rather than theological practices. And a lot of it was intended for as broad an audience as possible. So it never really dug down into any philosophy of ministry about a particular tribe. And so I'd written some books, and I thought I can do something. And so God was gracious to give me the idea of who should plant, why we need to plant more churches, what Calvary Chapel is all about, how to plant, and then some really practical lessons that you never learn in Bible college or seminary about things like budgets and boards and like baptism. You know, we might understand the theology of baptism, but
how do you baptize someone?
Well, a guy my size, 5'4", when they're baptizing someone like Mike, 6'4", that person thinks he's going to meet Jesus this afternoon. Like, how's this guy going to get me out of the water? Yeah. So you learn to rotate the hips, but you just don't learn those lessons.
It's like a WikiHow. It has the pictures like step 1, rotate your hips. Step 2, place your hand behind their head.
Amen. So in that, we just then included an appendix on how to teach people to teach the Bible. And we felt in our movement, we place such an emphasis on teaching the Bible, but we're not necessarily teaching people, giving them meaningful feedback beyond like, hey, great job, or you crushed it, to give them some, so to speak, line-by-line critique of what they did well and how they can grow so that over a course of time.
And it's in Spanish too, right? Translated into Spanish.
It's been translated into Spanish, been translated into French. It is being translated into Tagalog, translated into Hindi, translated into German, Hungarian, Russian, Ukrainian, and I am sure there's some language that I forgot, but it'll be available in 9 languages. So,
Mike, coming back to Mexico, I feel like there's going to be some people out there that are going to listen. They're going to listen to the show who have a heart to plant in Mexico, maybe from Mexico themselves, but most likely from the United States. And here's a question that I've been thinking about. You went over and did this, and you said you did something. You didn't do some things you wish you would have done, that sort of thing. Do you think it is still a good idea for Americans to go to other countries like Mexico, let's take Mexico specifically, and be involved in long-term mission work, more specifically church planting work? Is it still a good idea?
Yes, absolutely, if God calls. So, to have an American, again, that's what Paul the Apostle did.
Okay.
He was a cross-cultural missionary. He went into countries and cities that he was not from, planted a church, a healthy church.
That's a good point. I mean, that's a pretty good biblical model, isn't it?
And then he raised up the locals.
Yeah.
And so, Paul was sent out of his home church, which is Antioch, Acts 13, and then he went to all these new areas, the Roman Empire. So, yes, absolutely. I've seen guys doing it. Again, but the goal has to be to raise up the nationals. And I mean, you've done it. You've planted a church and passed it on to a national. And if God ever calls me home from Rosarito, I'm going to pass it on to a national. But yeah, absolutely. Especially to a major city, I don't think an American would do so well in a small little village.
Like the village
Those
communities.
are a lot more closed off. Yeah. But to a major city, actually, a lot of Americans are considered cool. If you, not that we want to bring in the American church, but the Americans, not the American style worship, contemporary worship is cool and they enjoy it.
Yeah.
And so yes, absolutely, especially in the big cities.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, Mike, I want to circle back, if we can, to the cross-cultural idea. So I think when I'm a tourist and traveling in different parts of the world, I look at the architecture, I look at the food, I look at clothing, dress, and that's not really how we understand culture. It's things like the values, the shared experience, and where the authority structure lies. I think, for example, in Mexico, we might assume that the authority structure lies with the male in the household, but it might not be. It might not even be the woman in the household. It might be the grandmother, the maternal figure. How did you learn some of the things about different culture in Mexico that were critical to understand cross-cultural mission?
Well, one of the things I learned was the females are the spiritual leaders of the home. You know, and it has nothing to do with authority. It just has to do with the guys mostly were drunks. And so it was the mom's job to drag the kids into the Catholic Church. And what happened was that got carried over into Christianity. And so when I would visit a number of early smaller churches when I got there, and great pastors doing their best, but it was literally on an average church in Rosarito, there would be 25 women, 40 kids, and 2 men. And, you know, just a very weak church because they weren't reaching the men because culturally the women were the spiritual leaders. And so we tried to change that by reaching the men. So that was kind of the main cultural thing that I had. And I said, hey, man, a church full of women is awesome, but it's not a strong church. Yeah. And so that is kind of one of the main cultural things I saw that I wanted to change up, and we have done that actually.
How long did it take you to figure that out about the culture, some of the shared values, the authority structure, or just the dynamic of men and women and leadership in the home, spiritual leadership?
Well, it took me a long time, and you know, raising up locals, I have a rule: I never make any cultural decisions myself. You know, the Mexicans on our staff, and I'm not even talking Mexican Americans, which are really 50-50. The Mexicans on our staff make all cultural decisions. For example, Halloween. You know, I wanted to do a fall festival, and let's get the kids in and get them candy.
Harvest festival.
Yeah, harvest festival. How can that not be
Trunk
a
or
great
treat.
idea? Yeah,
Guys,
everybody
trunk or
does
treat.
it up here. And I wanted to do it so bad. I wanted to get all of our kids out and give them a bunch of candy and have them dress up as Bible characters. And I gave my greatest, you know, reasons on how this is a great thing and a godly thing. And our Mexican pastors just said, absolutely not. You will stumble people so bad if you do that. How can this be wrong? And I just submitted to them. And so in 20 years, we've never done a fall festival. I still think it'd be a great idea. But I've submitted to them because in culture, they know the culture and I don't.
You know what stumbles me is the candy that has chili powder on the outside of it.
What? We have a lot of that.
Yeah. Also, I mean, Mike, you and Sarah I'm blessed to say that the two of you are friends, very close friends with Karen and I know your story as a couple. And Sarah had such a burden for the people of Mexico, and she continues to. And what sort of role does that play in cross-cultural mission as far as church planting in your perspective?
Yeah, well, I would not be in Mexico without Sarah. And, you know, it was her that got the burden before me. And she actually married me believing by faith that God would change my heart. I mean, I did tell her, look, I'm open. I'll go to Africa. I'll go to Asia. I'll go to Mexico. I'll go anywhere. But, you know, not on your word. You know, God needs to speak to me too. And she married me by faith because she really was committed to that. And so when God changed my heart, it was literally overnight. I woke up one morning and I said, Sarah, we're moving to Mexico. And she said, don't you mock my calling. She thought I was joking, but I wasn't joking. It was an overnight where God put that calling. Now, we didn't leave for over 2 years after that, which were actually the 2 most difficult years waiting to be sent and doing things right.
Yeah, but let's say you've got a church planter who's coming into that culture and he feels a real burden for that culture. His spouse supports the vision of church planting. She's just struggling because this culture is different. And going to this market, the local market is different, making change, public transportation, language, school for the kids. And the spouse is just struggling. What advice would you give him? What encouragement?
Yeah, I would, first of all, when we send out a church planter, the wife has to tell us these words, I am called. Mm-hmm. The wife has to tell us.
Not he is called?
No, not he is called.
Yeah.
Not he is called and I will submit. That sounds great in a pastor's office, but it doesn't cut it when you get out there and life's falling apart. So the wife actually has to say, I am called, because she's going to have to lean on her own calling. But that's a new rule we put in about 10 years ago, because a couple of our church plants failed when we were fine with the wife saying, I'll submit, but when they got out on the field and all hell broke loose, she had a real trouble submitting and believing that he was actually called. How could he be called if things are so difficult? So, what I would say for a man, it's mainly the husband's job. You be gentle, you'll be supportive. Don't put any burdens on your wife. Let her know she's invited to join you in any of the activities, but she doesn't have to, especially if you move to the mission field with little kids. I know you did that. We moved to Mexico with a 2-year-old girl and a 2-week-old boy, which is about the dumbest thing any church planter could ever do. But that's what we did. And we never even thought that it would be make life harder. But my wife was so tough and so strong, and she had that calling though. And so, but again, if she's really struggling, then the husband really needs to just minister to her and love her and listen to her and, maybe spend more time with her. And
that goes across the board, not just for international missions church planting. That's church planting in general. You're planting down the street. Your spouse has to be on the same page.
Yeah, amen. So. But how do you go about, or what would you suggest to prepare the spouse just for the culture shock, so to speak, of uprooting, leaving family, leaving friends, leaving familiar for this new culture, whether it's within their country or in a distinct country? What do you recommend?
Yeah, well, the way we train them up is we have our wives in the church planting class with the husbands.
Fantastic.
And we did not do that for a while. My dream was my wife would have a big burden to raise up church planting wives. My wife works.
How's that dream going?
It's going great, because now I realize it was never God's dream. And so what I realized after a while, my wife works full time. She's an awesome lady.
Amen.
Is that I need to do it. She's not the pastor.
So you're living the dream.
Yeah, actually, it's amazing. So now I'm much closer to the church planting wives. I mean, my wife gets to know them and she loves them, but I'm much closer to the church planting wives, and they're in the church planting class, and they do amazing, by the way. They study harder. A lot of times they're a better teacher, and they get a closer relationship with me. So periodically, I get a call from a church planting wife. Would you call my husband? Something like that. And I'm like, absolutely. I'm sure he's really sorry for whatever he's doing, but yes, I will call him. And
we get those calls too.
Yeah. And so the best I can do is I try my best now to help them and train them before they go, and make sure that they know that they can call me and check in with me, and if they need help, call me, and if they need marriage counseling, call me or whatever. And so it's been difficult, but the best thing that we've been doing is having the wives now in the church planting course so they can ask questions along the way.
How long is the church planting course? How long does it go for?
It's generally 2 years. But again, ultimately, if you examine Acts 13 really carefully, the elders laid hands on Paul and Barnabas. So it wasn't like they set the time. The Apostle Paul didn't say, guys, I'm going out tomorrow, do a sending Sunday today. And that's the Apostle Paul. So what I get out of that is the church set the time when they thought Paul and Barnabas were ready. And again, my 2 early church plants, I let them go too soon because I was so eager. How could this fail? They both went to their hometown, and how could it fail? And so now me and our pastors decide when they're ready. In fact, one of our most successful church plants, probably numbers wise, at the end of 2 years, I said, you guys aren't ready. They were so mad at me. I mean, I'm like, I love you guys so much, but you're not ready to go. You need to do a 3rd year. And nobody has to take a 3rd year. I know you guys, but I promise you it'll be worth it. They weren't falling for that one. So they actually did a 3rd year, and we got to send them out. to Loretto, this beautiful town halfway down, and they're the most loving couple, but they just needed a little more training. And they're 2 years in, and they have 180 adults coming, and they just started their church planting program.
That's great.
So,
That's
but
great.
generally it's 2 years.
What's your vision for Mexico and church planting? Is it more Americans coming over? Is it churches starting these church planting programs? What's your vision over the next 5 years or so?
So the vision for us is that all of our church plants start their own church planting program, and again, they all have a bunch of excuses why they're not ready, and they don't have the money, and they don't have the gifted people, and all of this. So we actually make them agree that they'll do it after a year. You can start it with 2 people.
That's one of the requirements of going through the program that you have.
Yeah.
Is in the first year, you guys are going to plant a church.
You're going to start the church planting program after the first year.
Okay.
So we give you a year to start, and then after that, there's no request that you're going to plant churches. We just want them to start the class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no quota. But the
just
class
start
starts.
the class, because it's also going to become a leadership factory. You're going to get leaders, and it's the best thing for you.
What would you say to senior pastors? This applies to Mexico or America or wherever you are. They're not, because what I'm hearing from you is church planting is a big part of your church.
Yeah.
Like your congregation knows that, right?
Yes.
They know that's what we're about.
Yeah, that's our missions program.
That's your missions program.
Yeah.
So what would you say to a lead pastor, a senior pastor, to encourage them to make church planting, maybe not the main thing they do, but at least a significant part of it? Because it is the Great Commission.
Yeah. So a couple things. Number one, start talking about it from time to time from the pulpit by faith. Guys, I really believe that God has called our church to be a sending hub of church planting. I don't know how this is going to look, but I want you to be praying. Number two, start putting finances towards it. Okay, if they don't have any church planters, then start supporting 1 or 2 out of your missions budget. Mm-hmm. And then number 3, pray about taking that next step of starting a church planting program. I've never seen anybody start a church planting program saying, I've got 10 great guys that are going to plant 10 great churches. I mean, they come in messed up, screwed up, struggling marriages.
It's a discipleship process.
It's a discipleship program.
Yeah.
And as you get the ball rolling, you see God call a few. And again, we've got 50 people in our church planting program. Most of them aren't going to go out. And I even tell them that, but I never tell them who I think, And so maybe 10 out of the 50, if we're really blessed, will go out eventually.
During the sermon critique, you're like, that first point was a little weak, and you could have done better on the illustration. Oh, yeah, and you're not going to go out to plant a church.
You're never
Don't
going to
worry
go
about it, though, because you're never going.
And so those are the things, mention it from time to time, and then start putting some budget towards it. Pray about starting a church planting program. And then the other thing is start asking God and praying that God would send you the called, because we want to equip the called.
And I think He'll do that. If you have that in place, God's going to see those churches and provide those people. I just wanted to give a plug for Cultivate here, because a lot of our listeners may be in a smaller church or a church that you don't have any access to church planting materials. CultivateChurchPlanting.com, and that's why we've isn't that right, Bruce? That's why we've created this infrastructure, not to plant churches ourselves, but to come alongside of church planting programs, local churches, to help you facilitate that in any way we can. So.
Yeah, we've seen it over decades that in a local church, whether it's 50 people, 500 people, 5,000 people, whether it's in Lima, Peru, Nairobi, Kenya, Manhattan, New York City, Manhattan, Kansas, that people can be trained using the resources that we've developed collectively among the 3 of us.
Yep.
And that the local church is the best place to train church planters. Can I just jump in on
Go
the
ahead.
question you asked, Mike?
So by all means.
I think as another interim step before starting a church planter training program is starting a school of ministry or school of discipleship type program, and then adding an element to that of a teacher training program. And of those people who are faithful, perhaps a residency or internship program, and if people have demonstrated that gifting in those contexts, they're probably ready to get involved in a church planter training
What if you want
program.
to, I'm thinking of these, what if you have a church and you want to start something like this, but only 1 or 2 people are going to come? You still start it, or you wait until you get more people, or?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that you start with a few, even if it's a small group, and develop that coalition of the willing, and then more will come.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, Yeah, I think in the context of a school of discipleship, you probably have more people enrolled than you might in a church planting context. It just seems that the bar might be higher. But
What do you think, Mike?
Let me comment on that. So, great point. So when our church planters start their class, I recommend they not call it church planting because that's scary.
Yeah.
And so I want them to do the same thing. But I recommend they call it, School of Ministry or School of Discipleship.
Yeah.
Simply because that phrase will scare people off if they've never heard it. I absolutely serious. I always say, down the road, you can call it School of Church Planting if you want. It doesn't really matter. But don't call it that right away because it's going to scare people.
Interesting.
So,
yeah, that's a good point, though, because you know that not all of the people, there's only a percentage of the people are going to actually go plant churches anyway, and this course is going to be good for them regardless.
Yeah. Everybody who participates is going to be better equipped to follow Jesus, better equipped to serve the local church, better equipped to make disciples of others, and some of them will actually be equipped and called to go out and plant churches. It's kind of like you put people into the funnel, and at the end of the process, you've got this distilled essence of people called, qualified, and prepared to go out.
Yes, and let me just say I'm honored and blessed to be a part of Cultivate. We sent out a church plant just last week, Brian De La Cruz, down near Mexico City. He is a Cultivate church planter. He's going through the materials, and it's been a big blessing for him and for me to be a part of Cultivate. So thanks for the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you, man, because Cultivate it really depends on the relationships that we have and the coaches. I mentioned this at another point, but if you go on our website, you'll be able to see between 40 and 50 now coaches.
Oh, there's 60.
60 coaches of
and
guys.
Mike's good-looking face is one
Mike's
of them.
on there,
So
and
sorry.
all over the world, which is incredible. Cultivate, the success of the program is not so much the program itself, it's the relationships that we have with these guys that are going to come alongside of church plants.
The people are the program.
The people are the program. Bruce is always good with words. All right, Mike, as we're cutting this to a close, what would you say, and I always ask people this, the one thing that you know now that you wish you would have known then that you would have done differently?
Amen.
Yeah, I mentioned this. I just gave a talk. What I would recommend is that the church planting program is designed to empower the planter to fulfill God's calling on his life, not for the planter to fulfill my will or what I think needs to be done. And that's very hard. That's very hard for a pastor because they're so used to making decisions, and they're great leaders. And they see a need and they want to.
They have vision. You have
they
vision.
have
for
vision,
something.
you know, and hey, we've got to have somebody plant a church over here. And when I'm talking to senior pastors that are wanting to get involved in church planting, they always have these places
that
they want people to plant in. And I understand that. It's a great desire. And because I did that at the start. But it didn't work so well. And so now...
well, it worked for you to plant your church that God called you to.
It did.
Rosarito, but not for others.
Yeah, not when I was trying to tell others where to go. And so now...
God has a wonderful plan for your life, and I'm going to tell it to you.
I'm going to tell you what it is.
And so to empower them to hear from God and to help them get equipped to do the great work that God's called them, he and his wife, and hopefully a team to do. And so that's a big change I've had. And we've had a lot more success when we put the onus on them to hear from the Lord about the location. And a lot of them haven't heard of a location yet. And I go, you know why? It's not God's timing yet. And once you do get the location, you and I are going to together work on the timing, which really means I'm going to help you with the timing. But so it's empowering them to hear from the Lord God's call for their lives.
That's great. That's
Brian
great.
and I are still Googling onus.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, I know that's important.
It's a big word.
Mike, thanks so much for being on the show, and we want to get you
Pastor.
back on here. You're doing a great job. Wonderful work there in Mexico.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Honor to be here.
Bruce, thanks for being with us. Any last words?
Yeah, it's just so grateful for the influence that you've had, not only expanding God's kingdom, but the friendship that we've cultivated through
Thanks,
this
Pastor.
decade-plus relationship.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I want to get a button that every time someone says cultivate in a sentence, like a buzzer goes off. Ding, ding, ding.
I thought I got 10 points for every time I mentioned that.
Yeah. You've got it like 30 now. All right. Thanks, guys, for being on the show. CultivateChurchPlanting.com for anyone out there listening, because we have the resources, we have the infrastructure to plant 1,000 churches over the next 10 years, connecting with you and the local church and mentors and coaches, assessment, the works, and CultivateChurchPlanting.com. Thanks for listening, and thank you guys for being on the show today.
You got it.